I'm here at the food forest of Farmer A. Farmer A is an expert in syntropic agroforestry and permaculture. He planted all these trees here in 2020, and now they're producing fruit and towering over me. And now I'm here at Farmer B's food forest. Farmer B is not doing such a good job. He also planted everything in the year 2020, but you can tell he just doesn't have the skills. He ought to take more syntropic agroforestry courses and more permaculture courses, because he actually gave everything here the same level of care, same level of maintenance, and all the same amendments as Farmer A. But do you want to know a secret? I'm Farmer A. And I'm Farmer B. And this is the same farm. So what happened here? It's the same farm, the same farmer, and the same treatment. Is it maybe that the plants here have worse genetics, or maybe this part of the farm received less rainfall over the course of the past 5 years? Well, let me tell you another little secret. It's the soil. Maybe you've heard of a little geographic feature of this world known as the Andes Mountains. Well, that's where we are. And it's actually very common in mountainous terrain for soils, as well as their parent materials, to be extremely variable, even across very short distances. As in this situation, Farmer A's plot and Farmer B's plot are located only about 100 meters apart, yet the soils are extremely different in both locations. And that brings me to what I consider the biggest myth of permaculture. And that myth is that you only need to add biology. Now, if I'm going to be totally honest, both plots did not receive equal treatment. That's because plot A, after about a couple years, was leaving this area in the dust. I mean, the growth rate was much quicker over there. So at that point in time, I began to start adding more to this area. We added compost and mulch, and we even did chicken tractoring, and now also geese are walking around this area. So if anything, plot B has actually had more biology added over time. In the permaculture community, there's a pretty common dualistic view that says you either add nutrient inputs such as fertilizers, or you increase biology. I prefer to do both, and I think what's missing from the conversation is the term nutrient capital reserves, which refers to the amount of nutrients that are in the soil profile that are not necessarily available to the plants, but which potentially could be over the course of time. So the problem in this part of the landscape is not the lack of biology. We've been having chicken tractors come through here for months, just rotating back and forth on this little section of the landscape. We've added compost and other soil amendments here. And what the problem actually is here is the geology, not the lack of biology. The problem is that we're sitting basically on top of sandstone right here. So even if that parent material degrades over time, it's just going to turn into a sandy material, which isn't going to provide very many minerals to the plants. So you can see this Metahuayo tree is about the same size as the day that we planted it over 5 years ago. It hasn't grown that much. It's just now responding and starting to develop a little bit better following the application of potassium sulfate. This ice cream bean species is actually a pioneer tree here, and we planted this one from seed about 3 years ago. Normally after 3 years they'd be about 20 feet tall, but you can see this one's still really stunted. So even the pioneer trees struggle in this part of the landscape. This lucuma tree here is barely bigger than the day we planted it 5 years ago and counting. Alright, so this plant has also had compost, as I mentioned, but it's planted near where a leafcutter ant nest was. This is basically right on top of a leafcutter ant nest. And those ants actually develop fungus underground. So you would figure that it aerated parts of the subsoil here and incorporated fungus, which would stimulate biology into the subsoil from the breakdown of all the organic matter that they add into those layers of the subsoil. But even still, it didn't develop properly until we started applying some fertilizer to it. So in the tropics, there's very low nutrient capital reserves a lot of the time, with most of the nutrients being tied up in the living biomass, such as in the rainforests. And when people burn down the rainforest and plant into the ashes, they like to use quick cash crops like corn and bananas. But those eventually lose productivity through unsustainable practices. And then when people notice declines in productivity, they'll switch over to a longer term perennial crop such as coffee. And eventually, if they aren't using sustainable practices, the coffee production will decline over time. And when that happens, there's usually two routes that people go. They can either let the land go fallow and let it turn back into a secondary forest over the course of about 2 decades, or they often turn it into pasture and do extensive cattle operations, which degrades the soil even further. So if you inherit such a property like I did, after multiple decades, the soils have been leached of quite a bit of nutrients, and it's generally not a practice where people come and add nutrients here. So it's more of an extraction. And furthermore, what exacerbates the problem is the burning that people like to do. Even the ranchers here, they will typically burn their pastures once a year in the dry season. So this is a chart that I've been working on, and I'm planning to work with the local government to do a community outreach program to try and educate the local people that if they want to burn, then it is actually something that's going to hurt themselves economically. And what you can see here with the chart is that it can actually be pretty significant economically. I mean, even with pastures, about $400 per hectare. And of course, I translated all this from Spanish and Peruvian soles to share with you. We purchased this property that had 10 hectares of pasture. Now, if the previous owners were burning those 10 hectares every year, that would be $4,000 of nutrient lost every year. So it's illogical to assume that if you inherit such a landscape that you can just come in and just, whip up some compost tea and the magic of nature is just going to take care of the rest, and you're going to be able to achieve a high level of production from fruit trees. It's just not realistic to expect that. So quite on the contrary, you would have to come in and add quite a bit of inputs if you do want to achieve a level of production in this lifetime. So there's a couple types of soil tests that I'd like to talk about. This is an example right here of the sort of traditional soil test, what I would call your traditional soil test, which measures the plant available portion of each nutrient. And these kinds of tests are very limited in value to me. And a lot of people criticize them as just being fertilizer sales tools. And for a number of the nutrients, they're not very useful because they can vary widely from just one day to the next, depending on moisture content and different factors. So for example, the reason I don't like these tests very much is because, let's look at phosphorus, for example. In the top cell, we've got 9.49 parts per million. All that's telling us is this is the amount from your sample that would be available to a plant right now. It doesn't tell us, oh, here's another big reservoir of phosphorus that might be available tomorrow, or if you add the right mycorrhizal fungi to your soil, you can unlock another 100 parts per million over here. It doesn't tell us the total amount of phosphorus that's in the soil. All it tells us is a snapshot of, okay, here's what's available to the plant right now. Okay, this is the other kind of soil test I want to talk about. This is a total elemental soil test. And this one was conducted using inductively coupled plasma. Basically, what this test does, unlike the other test, is it looks at the entire amount of, say, potassium or phosphorus that's in your soil sample. Now, that portion of phosphorus is the overall amount. It includes all forms, the forms that are available right now for the plant, the forms that might be available tomorrow, and the forms that will never be available. But what I like about this test is that it gives us an idea. So say on the first test I showed the example of phosphorus. Okay, it says 9 parts per million, which is okay. But what happens if we only have 20 parts per million overall that we're working with? Well, then we're probably in trouble and we need to add phosphorus. Now I've highlighted in this example the potassium because I showed a very low amount in the first test, about 30 parts per million, I think it was. And here it shows 128 parts per million in the topsoil. And that's actually not a very good amount. You want to have a lot more than that for a total amount. Even if this was the plant available portion, that would be considered a low amount. So I'm actually in trouble here. And this is a very big deal. Potassium is an expensive fertilizer. It's an expensive nutrient to acquire. Now here's the subsoil from that same part of the property with 93 parts per million of total potassium. That includes what's available right now, what might be available tomorrow, and what might never be available to our plants. And so we're in big trouble. We need to get a lot more potassium into the soil. And this kind of soil test, I think, is useful because if I would just go blindly based on the typical traditional test that tells me the available potassium, I won't know if, okay, all I need to do here is add biology and then I get to unlock this huge potassium reserve. Now, in this case, I can add all the biology I want, but I don't have a huge reserve of potassium, so it's not going to really do me any good. And a lot of the agronomists here in Peru, they actually don't like this test, but I think that's just because they haven't really been trained on what the role of biology is in terms of unlocking nutrient reserves in the soil profile. But I think it's very useful just because of that reason. I mean, if I would just go blindly based on the available amounts and say, okay, I just need to do my compost teas, put my bugs in a jug, and that way we're going to improve the conditions for potassium solubilizing bacteria, and we're going to be able to access a lot of this potassium over time. Well, now I know by doing this test that there is not a lot of potassium to be accessed over time. So I know, okay, well, let's focus on potassium now. We need to add potassium. And the reason I highlighted molybdenum here is because in permaculture circles, a lot of people are all excited about the nitrogen fixers, and it's sort of a panacea. But nitrogen fixers, in order to do what they do, they require a lot of, well, first of all, phosphorus because of ATP. It's a very intensive process, biological nitrogen fixation. But they also require cobalt and molybdenum. And I'm just highlighting the fact that I didn't even get a detectable amount of molybdenum. So even if I want to just add my nitrogen fixers here, they're going to need quite a bit of help too. And this part right here shows a rock sample from that same part of the landscape, Sector B. That was the part of the landscape that Farmer B was talking about. And so you can see that the parent material is 130 parts per million. It really isn't going to add much potassium over time. So even if we get our biology to break down the rocks of the soil, they're really not going to provide us with the potassium that we need in terms of good production for our fruit trees. So we definitely want to add that. There's a few different sources of potassium that we could go with. The cheapest is probably potassium chloride, but I don't like potassium chloride. It's too high on the salt index. So I definitely don't want to use that one. The other alternative that we have locally is ashes. There's an industry here for making bricks, and they use a lot of combustible materials, sawdust. They use rice husks here because there's lots of rice production. So we could probably get rice husk ash even for free. But ultimately, I decided that potassium sulfate is the best when you pencil out the costs. Even for free, the rice husk ash only has about 1% potassium, and it's actually more expensive for us just because we need to get huge amounts of that to equal what we could get with modest applications of potassium sulfate. So the transportation costs actually outweigh the high prices of potassium sulfate. Potassium sulfate is actually one of the more expensive fertilizers here in Peru. So the other test we did in Sector B was a foliar test with avocados. And this basically confirmed the nutrient deficiencies that we learned about in the soil test. So you can see the boron deficiency, the extreme potassium deficiency. That's reflected in the fact that the avocados are not able to take up those nutrients because they're not there in the first place. And for example, boron, that's actually very common in the Amazon basin to be deficient in the soil profiles. So that's not much of a surprise. The potassium we talked about, that's an expensive fix. But you're just not going to get these nutrients with your bug in a jug product. And these are nutrients, these are minerals. They need to be brought in. They've been lost. A lot of them have been exported via leaching to Brazil and the Atlantic Ocean. So this is something that needs to be corrected, and there's significant economic costs. So I hope by making this video, you've learned to take multiple different kinds of soil tests, especially the total elemental soil tests, to be able to know what you're getting yourself into ahead of time. These are things I wish I would have learned. I wish I would have known what I was getting myself into here, because these are expensive fixes to make. And yes, I agree with a lot of what permaculture preaches. The goal here is definitely to leverage the existing nutrients with biology, but we should not assume that biology can substitute deficiencies at the mineral level, especially when it comes to total levels of nutrients. So hopefully this was helpful for you. I know this is information I wish I would have known about before starting our reforestation project. And if you know of any permaculture projects out there where they've shared a total elemental soil test, then I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I think a lot of the more successful high-profile examples of permaculture-based restoration projects out there are built on soils with sufficient nutrient capital reserves. But in any case, there's a lack of transparency out there. Hey, if you like this kind of content, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. Also hit the like button, sign up for notifications, and whatever other options YouTube has. It's going to help the algorithm. It's going to get our project out there more, and more people are going to know about it. Alright, I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, bye.